everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to see so many faces here, lots of new ones and familiar ones. It looks like we're somewhat standing room only, and there are seats on the floor here and there. Oh, hi, Sandy. So welcome to this fantastic event presenting Dr. Rebecca Ingram's new book that we are just seeing today in actual physical form. That's very exciting. And I am Dr. Amanda Petersen. I am a colleague of Dr. Ingram in the Language, Cultures, and Literatures department, and also work in the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Office as an associate dean. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Ingram before she does a little chat about her book, and then Martin, Dr. Repinecz, and I will lead in a few questions, and then we'll let you guys also open questions. So it is really a delight for me to present this book for a dear friend and a dear colleague and kind of welcome you to this space. Dr. Ingram has been a professor here at USD since 2009. She is recently this year promoted to full professor. She is not only author of this fantastic monograph and book from Vanderbilt Press, but she's also been participating in all sorts of ways as a co-editor and author for all sorts of publications that are talking about gastronomy, gastrocracy, I'm saying it wrong, cultural food studies and culinary studies. It has been an honor and a privilege to watch her grow as a scholar and as a colleague over the years. We more or less started in the same cohort. And she really is a groundbreaking scholar in culinary and food studies, not only in the Hispanic studies field, but also on this campus. She is one of our inaugural food studies professors on this campus. And I would say as a colleague and a feminist colleague, and we share gender studies as a discipline together. One of the things that is delightful about presenting this book is that we are two feminists who also choose the kitchen, and culinary works as a language of love and a language of care collectively. And so part of my question that I will be thinking about listening to Dr. Ingram and listening to Dr. Repinecz, and his question is, what does it look like when you have very proud, shameless feminists who join together in a space that has typically been relegated just as women's work? And how are we transforming those kind of space and those kind of actions in studies like this that Rebecca is doing? So with that, I'll invite Dr. Ingram to share with us.
Wow, y'all, this is amazing. I am feeling super delighted to see all of your lovely faces here today. I'm going to do my best to talk into the microphone. If I ever need to speak up, just please let me know. Before we get started, I just want to thank Dr. Brian Clack and also Lindy Villa for hosting this event here in the Humanities Center. It's wonderful to have a space and forum to discuss humanities research, and their work in this space is vital to how we at USD value humanities thinking and its role in the liberal arts. I also want to thank Dr. Marcel Maese-Cohen, the director of the Women and Gender Studies program. Her support has made possible the lovely snacks that you have available to you in this other room. We couldn't have a food studies event without some food. So I hope you'll help yourselves to lemon bars and cookies. This project has received so much support from people on this campus. And I just want to particularly acknowledge Dr. Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you, Noelle. And as USD further develops programs of study in food studies, I'm hopeful that the approach that this book represents is one that USD will be inclusive of. I think it's fascinating, and I hope you do too. So we're going to get started. Gracias, Even. That last sentence is a paraphrase of what Emilia Pardo Bazan wrote. What do we observe? What are the words that stand out to you as engaging? Yes. Absolutely. Reclaiming an idea. What else stands out to you? Any other things catch your attention? Visitors, folks who aren't students but are feeling like they're returning to a classroom? Martin?
The Spanish race.
Right.
We can talk about the Spanish nation, but it's notable to me that the word race is used there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Pardobasan is connecting women's food work to politics, to citizenship, and to the practices of women that I argue anchor Spain's modernization. And what follows, I'm going to briefly give an overview of each chapter in this book. And then my colleagues, Dr. Repinecz and Dr. Petersen, have formulated some great questions so we can deepen our conversation into the topics addressed. The first chapter has to do with Doña Emilia Pardo Bazán. You may find it interesting that I call her a culinary nationalist and also an ambivalent feminist. I'm going to get into some of those complications. She is most well known as one of the 19th century novelists and intellectual who introduced naturalism to Spain, and one of the most ardent supporters of feminism for Spanish women. We see in the quotation we just looked at that she saw cooking and food as key to the health of modern Spain and the Spanish race. And so why do I describe her feminism as ambivalent? What's up with that? I argue that it's because when it came to the working class, she was much more conservative than we see in other work. This is disconcerting for scholars today because we have celebrated her novels and short stories as some of the most nuanced and expressive of late 19th century and early 20th century Spain, how it represents everybody from the peasantry to the working class. We have also celebrated her as a canonical writer, one of the very few women who can claim that status, and a foundational feminist when we're talking about feminist studies in Spain. But that impression shifts, as I argue, when we see the dismissive and even dehumanizing ways that she frames working class cocineras or cooks and Spanish workers who in the period of this study were becoming more politically active and at the same time violent. So we can get more into Pardo Bazán if we want to later. But the next chapter, Frivolous and Feminist, Carmen de Burgos's culinary political platform, is another well-known Spanish feminist and novelist, Carmen de Burgos, whose culinary writing just provides a fascinating contrast with what we see in Pardo Bazán. Y'all, this woman was dismissed. She was ridiculed. She left her abusive husband early in her marriage to move and earn her living as a teacher and as a newspaper writer. She was the long-term lover of Ramón Gómez de la Serna, well-known writer from this period, much better known than Carmen de Burgos for sure. He later had an affair with her daughter, which is always very scandalous. She wrote manuals on topics from the arts of seduction to how to be a woman. She also wrote cookbooks, news articles, the most well-known was the plebiscite that she ran on divorce, and novels and scholarly works that have made her the peer of more acknowledged scholars of this period. Her culinary writing has been absolutely overlooked. And that's because they aren't labeled as part of her intellectual work. And let's be clear, these texts were not for erudite readers. They weren't for intellectuals necessarily. They were for women who could read, but who didn't have a cook or a large household staff to take care of the kitchen work. And those texts show how women and their domestic tasks, their food work, were part of Spanish modernization. She was mocked. A peer body shamed her in print and insinuated that she submitted a recipe for tortilla, or an omelet, to a literary magazine instead of a poem. But she turned that mocking on its head to reach women readers with an understanding of feminism that was accessible to them and their lived experiences, rather than alienating. So these first chapters, and here we see, just to talk about the pictures a little bit, we see Carmen, la pobre, the body shamed one, lovely woman. And this is actually her cookbook here. It came out in an Obras Completas collection in the 1920s. And you will recognize that we were able to modify the cover for this book, which is really lovely. It's an illustration by a man named Beau, who was a well-known illustrator of the period, who also created covers for a number of works of what was called kiosk literature that came out in the 1920s. So these first two chapters have to do with well-known feminist writers and their culinary writing. Chapters 3 and 4 do not have to do with Spain's women intellectuals in this moment. Instead, I really wanted to understand the roles of working class Spanish women and food from this period. What are working class culinary cultures that we can learn about in this period through the texts available to us? These were women who absolutely cooked in their own homes. Many also worked as servants in the homes of others, on the land, in restaurants and hotels. And this is the first one we're looking at, Nicolasa Pradera. The title of the chapter is Mythologies of Culinary Modernity, Gregorio Marañón and Nicolasa Pradera. She is described by Marañón as the priestess of Basque cuisine. I talk about this cuisine in chapter 3. Her cookbook was printed so many times throughout Francoism and after. And she went on to found one of the most emblematic restaurants in San Sebastián, Casa Nicolasa, that only closed in the last decade. But she started her career as an adolescent, as a servant, working in the kitchens of an upper class family. And she ascended to the upper middle class through her culinary education and food work. But what we see with her is incredible social mobility, but it's totally obscured by how Gregorio Marañón creates her persona in his writing about her. Marañón was a physician. He was a eugenicist and father of Spain's democratic Second Republic. And I'm happy to answer more questions about her, but I will say that this photo is one that was given to me by her grandson. So I'm looking forward to hearing from him what he thinks of my treatment of his grandmother whenever he receives a copy of my book. The final chapter, Cooking and Civic Virtue, Women Work in Barcelona, focuses on the Institut de Cultura y Biblioteca Popular de la Dona. So if you're in Barcelona, you're walking around the Sant Pere neighborhood, you have definitely walked right by this building. So this was one of several institutions that was founded in this period to educate women, to give them culture, donar cultura. And the most popular classes taught at this institution were its cooking classes. More than 40,000 students would attend these cooking classes just in 1 year. Many of those classes were taught by one of Spain's first celebrity chefs, Josep Rondizoni. The argument I make about the Institute has allowed me to explore ideas about how cooking and eating right, or according to modern ideas, was related to improving health and nutrition, especially for the working class. But there was a darker side too. Elites and the powerful were really worried about the working class. They worried about them as future citizens, as current citizens, and as people with the rights to vote. They worried about their politics. They worried that they might identify too much as workers, as communists, as socialists, or anarchists, and that these politics would threaten Spain, its stability, its traditions, and its identity. So nutrition and education about how to cook and eat right was a way to encourage middle-class values rather than working-class identities. And that is the crux of the argument I make in chapter 4. So you've gotten the summary. Before we move on to questions, just wanted to give you the delight of seeing a few more pictures of the cooking classes that were taught at the Institute. These are held, or when I consulted these archives, they were held at the Biblioteca Francesca Bonmaison in Barcelona. Since the archives have been moved, but I always think it's interesting to look at the stadium style seating in this class, where we have the chef professor, the center of authority, in the center, and all of the women scaled around him to observe what is going on. Here we have another image. These are women who are doing practicas, the practical part of a class, in the kitchen classroom or the kitchen laboratory at the Institute. And then here's another image of women who were working in the kitchen for the cafeteria, the eating hall that was a place for women workers to eat economically at the Institute during their day. So with that in mind, let's talk.
All right, it sounds like it's on. I will start out, and part of this is it's personal, and it's part of what you shared in your introduction, but it also is a shared culinary practice that we share in terms of foodways of the US and different culinary practices that are kept alive over generations, over different regions. And as generations change and move, and the ways in which foodways get maintained and get cultivated by certain individuals and practices and families. And this is something that I was alluding to in my introduction, that this is something that Rebecca and I very much practice in our kind of overall life together, in terms of shared regional practices of food that we share with lots of people who are in our lives. And I think I love your introduction because you invite us to think about those kind of food traditions that we have in our greater personal lives and give us a way to look at them more critically.
Excellent. Yeah, I'd be happy to respond to that. I mean, just as a question, how many of the folks in this room who identify as women noticed that they did lots of extra food work and care work over the years of the pandemic? I'm seeing some hands, right? Are we at the end of the pandemic? This is a debate, depends on if you're Biden, or we could talk all about that. Studies have come out in recent years that talks about the devastating effect this has had on women's lives, on folks who identify as women, all the food work and care work that they have done. And so one of the main points of this book is that food work is absolutely meaningful for families and communities. That food work is also political. And we have to understand women's food work as not just something that we dismiss or want to understand as what those cute women do outside of the important public debates about politics, and outside of important debates about what society should be like. In the personal sense, I was reflecting on, and I do this often, I teach a food studies class here at USD for first year students. Students have to write a critical analysis of their own food cultures. What does it mean to be a white woman from the Southern United States when I talk about my food cultures? If the food cultures that I identify with are ones that have largely been whitewashed. Michael Twitty is an excellent scholar of Black foodways, Black and kosher foodways of the US South. And so he's somebody that I have thought critically with in recent years to start unpacking what these personal identities, what these foodways that I identify with strongly mean when I do that critical work with my students and in my own life to understand what those intersections are between gender, social class, race. And this is something we talk about and have had wonderful conversations about. Thanks, Amanda.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. I think this book is really exciting. I have a follow-up question about the intersections with race and class and gender. But before we get there, I want to ask you about the period that you chose. you talk about women's role in modernization during this period, which is more or less, we might say, the first 3 decades of the 20th
Yes,
century.
absolutely.
So I was wondering, obviously modernization in Spain is a process that begins way before that and arguably continues later, right? So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how women's roles in modernization through food work during the period that you chose are different from the periods before and after, right? When we think about, for example, the longer 19th century, or of course, the Franco dictatorship is a big can of worms. But yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on what makes this period different compared to the periods before and after.
My answer to that question is that we really have to think about work and women's work and the visibility of that work in these decades. Maite Zubiaure and Roberta Johnson talk about how after the First World War, women working in the public sphere, women working at paid jobs, acquired a new social acceptability that was not the case, for example, during the 19th century. The dominant ideology in Spain in this period was one of the angel of the house, el ángel del hogar. This meant that women belonged in the domestic sphere and that their social roles involved influencing public life via male family members from that space, in addition to educating their children. So this was the dominant ideology, right? But in practice, the roles of women's work were much more varied. In peasant families, women were part of the productive unit of the home. Urban working class women worked in factories, right? They worked as servants. That work is radically undercounted by the state. Even then, their wages were understood as a supplement to male worker salaries because this dominant ideology said that women who worked really needed to hide that labor in the home. However, during the first 3 decades of the 20th century, we see women moving into the paid labor sphere as telegraph operators, as stenographers. At the Institute, they can take classes with a certificate and learn to read and also get work in kitchens and restaurants and hotels. Or do the work that many of them maybe had already done before for many decades, working as servants in private homes. Private homes where the people wanted to eat in a modern way. So during these first 3 decades, there were robust debates influenced by a diversity of political orientations about what women's public roles in society could be. Should that involve suffrage? Should that involve economic feminism? The founder of the Institute thought it was a catastrophe that women could not be educated and live moral lives and also work to support themselves, right? And then we also have to consider the perspective of Catholic feminism who participated in these debates. And then of course, all of this activity that culminated in women gaining the right to vote and to divorce in the Second Republic was shut down after the nationalists won the Spanish Civil War. And what we see there is a radical reversal in traditional women's roles. That was the only way to be. That was enforced by the Sección Femenina. And that national Catholic ideal became very powerful. And I would say, and this is something that I'm curious to investigate, it's something that over the years of the dictatorship, it's hard to move, so powerful. So I think that gets to some of your question, Martin.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
thank you.
So this question is a little bit, it's very much related about what you were talking about, but in terms, it's discussing kind of discipline and cultural studies. And in the same way that you are talking about how women's work was often discounted as something that was not important, discourses such as culinary and food and cultural type discourse and studies were also relegated to something that were not important, not intellectual, not cultural. So I was wondering 2 questions really, if you could explain a little bit to our audience how you take something that could be the everyday, the quotidian, and help ask questions that help us look at those things in a way that is intellectual and critical. And then also this relates to a lot of popular discourse. We all watch, celebrity chefs and food, popular culture, and we don't think of it as something that we could do intellectually or think about intellectually. So that's two
That
parts.
is the great challenge of food studies. We think it's fun. We think it's delightful. This is a serious field. My approach to these texts is that of any literary and cultural studies scholar. I employ close reading. I like to take students, and in my book, if you want to buy it, it is $37 hardcover, but for the paperback price, you will see a lot of that close reading that we usually direct towards what we consider conventionally literary texts. It's doing that close reading with an understanding of what was going on historically, what was going on politically, economically, and socially. So that's absolutely my approach. And I think one of the wonderful things about Carmen de Burgos in particularly, and I think this goes to a question you might have had, Martin, nobody really thought that she was serious about this book. Her serious writing was very much given a different kind of attention and has been by scholars who have looked at her work until now. The texts I analyze in this book are essentially a letter to her editor in two versions of an introduction. One that's more normal introduction length, 8 pages. Another that's a greatly expanded introduction of, I think I remember like 60, 70 pages, if I remember correctly. Y'all, that's the serious work. But what was she doing? She was using the mask of patriarchal expectations, right? Putting these essays in a cookbook that was supposed to be sold in a kiosk to, she needed to earn money. She was living by her own writing. But what I discovered in these texts are a lot of ideas that we see in her very explicit feminist writing. And so she uses the cover, what Zubiaude has called her frivolous chatter, right? To really embed these serious feminist ideas in texts where women don't expect to see them, and then almost pass unnoticed. And I think that's the interesting and subversive part of looking at culinary texts and thinking about gender studies, also the roles of social class. Thanks for that question.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. I'm wondering if we might put this conversation in dialogue with Spain today, right? As we know, 21st century Spain has seen a variety of what were once traditional women's roles, especially domestic labor, like caring for the children or the elderly, or for example, cleaning. Today, a lot of that labor has been significantly displaced from white Spanish women onto migrant or racialized women. So what is the relationship of food work and gender in Spain today? And how does it intersect with categories like race or migration status?
Thank you for that question. I would say that legislation about care work in contemporary Spain today has more to do with how it was understood 100 years ago than it does in any contemporary progressive sense. And Michelle Murray, in her book, Home Away from Home, makes this case beautifully. She discusses how Spanish law, Royal Decree 1620/2011, frames domestic work as a different class of labor. It encodes difference on the basis of that domestic work features a special relationship between employee and employer, guided by care and affect. Let's think about this: special, care, affect. All of these things mean that care workers in contemporary Spain have historically not had access to all the worker protections that other workers in Spain do. Who are the people taking care of our elderly in Spain? Who are the people working in kitchens? And why is their labor discounted? Why are they exploited under contemporary law? This is changing, happily, it seems. The ways that migrant and racialized women have been exploited, and how that has been encoded as legitimate, and how it replicates colonial dynamics is something that has elicited a lot of organization and protest about in recent years. Coalitions of care workers scored a wonderful win this past summer. Territorio Doméstico, which is a group that is organized because the traditional labor unions, their point is, don't want to take on this work. They had made it possible that the Spanish Congress voted in June to ratify an important agreement to regularize their status. So I think these debates are developing and ongoing. And I hope to be able to learn more about this in my next project, which is why I'm on sabbatical this year. Got to have new things to work on.
Thank you.
I think this question relates to a lot of what you were talking about in terms of care work and the people who conduct the care work and how that is part of an overall global migrant at least movement and migrant ways. And I was wondering if you could kind of connect that somewhat to some of the things that we see in our world, whether it's in Southern California or San Diego, but in terms of food work, in terms of global foodways, a lot of the kind of trendy food things that we have going on. I mean, we all know what Spanish tapas are and we think they're amazing and delicious. And we all have our favorite taco places in the city. And we have lots of opinions on what's the right kind of food in those ways. And also we tend to invisibilize all the people who are participating in the background of those conversations. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And that's a great question and very complex. So I will attempt to scratch the surface. First of all, how many of you, whenever you go eat Spanish food, whenever you want to eat tacos, whenever you want to eat certain things, do you need some help? No, okay. How many of you use authenticity as a criteria? Does that ring a bell? Yes, authenticity. What does authenticity mean? How do you understand authenticity? Right. 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 So we're absolutely. So we're looking for that same taste, the same smell, the same appearance. Any other ideas about authenticity? How we understand authenticity? What are we looking for when we're looking for that authentic restaurant? It tastes like your grandmother's and your mother's food. So one person, knowledge of Spain, those senses, those ingredients. Victor, you want your mom, your grandmother's food. I saw a hand over here. Right. We want the people in that place to be the people that we associate with the creators of that food. What if I told you that authenticity as a comment, as a concept is deeply problematic? How would that make you feel? I see some hands. What you understand? What is your thought about that? When you say that, it resonates with me as like discriminating against other people. That you're not taking into account. So your ideas about what constitutes authentic may not be other people's ideas about what constitutes authentic. Alexis, I saw you nod too.
Yeah, I was thinking about how a lot of restaurants in the United States Americanize their meals.
Right.
A specific first thing that came to mind was like kung pao chicken or like Panda Express, for lack of a better phrase. But a lot of the dishes that we associate as like Chinese food are really just American foods in Chinese restaurants.
Absolutely.
Eat them anywhere else in the world. I'm sure that that's the case for a lot of cuisines. So, you know, it's hard to tell what is authentic.
Absolutely. So yes, Elena.
I just want to sort of connect as permission to cook it and claim it as authentic, right? You know, it's fair. How would go and see the kitchen? You know, isn't necessarily who we expect to be in the kitchen, and what sort of negotiations and processes have to happen so that food can be marketed as authentic you know, do you have to hide people in the back?
Mhm.
Do you allow them to be in the front? What language are they speaking?
Right. There's a lot of questions about authenticity, and what Dr. Luna has just voiced is something that Arjuna Padurai, who is the theorist, who says it in much fancier language that than I can remember right now, is that ultimately evaluations of authenticity are going to be subjective, right? This makes me think of an anecdote by the author of the graphic novel Gazpacho Agridulce. Doesn't it ring a bell for anybody? Juanzo. She's a well-known illustrator in Spain working these days. She talks about how Chinese families in contemporary Spain label their cuisine as Japanese because they can charge more money for it and nobody knows the difference, right? So this goes into this entire debate about authenticity. Who are the people that we don't see back there in the kitchen doing that work? It's marginalized populations in Spain, racialized Spaniards or migrants. Here in San Diego, we could have a whole conversation about the populations that are doing that food work, in many circumstances and cases, underpaid and exploited. Just as a final note, because in theory, writing a whole nother book about these topics, Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, who is a well-known gastronomical writer of post-transition Spain, had a lot to say about cooking and gastronomy in Spain after the transition to democracy. And he was really upset about what he understood as the massification of Spanish food. The circulation of Spanish food, sangria and paella, was insufficient and offensive. He wanted Spanish gastronomy to reclaim itself and to be one of the revolutions of the post-transition period. But we have to ask ourselves, if we consider Juanzo's anecdote about contemporary Spain, can we call that a revolution? Or do we need to think more seriously about those bodies who are doing the cooking in contemporary Spain and what they're negotiating between foodways that should mingle and borrow, if you look at the demographics of contemporary Spain, versus the very intense connections and desires that folks in the peninsula have to celebrate what is unique and special about the foods that their communities identify with.
Right, thank you so much. A big part of another aspect of this authenticity conversation that comes to mind is the issue, the politics of which cuisines are considered prestigious, right? And which ones are considered ethnic, right? Which is so interesting with the Chinese-Japanese example. But even here in the United States, we might think about the differential ways in which, for example, Spanish and Mexican cuisines, right, are generally construed, right, in terms of how much you might expect to pay at a Spanish restaurant compared to a Mexican one and things like that, right? So yeah, it's interesting to think about how these, I mean, really, I think we can say racial politics, right? Frame not only the way that we understand the labor of people who are behind the kitchen, but also the cultural imaginaries that the foods that they are making are supposed to represent, and the hierarchies that we sort of create around them.
Absolutely. And this is why I think it's fascinating that all of these super fancy Michelin starred chefs in Spain have become stakeholders in all conversations about food and gastronomy these days. And so to understand that as a racialized politics is absolutely work that needs to be done.
Example you gave, how the Chinese families charge more just by labeling food as Japanese, right?
Right. Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, intelligence or a way to survive, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I could continue asking questions all day, but at a certain point, I think we need to open it up up to the audience.
Thank you for the
Yeah,
questions.
of
Yeah, that
course.
was something.
Let's hear some questions from the audience. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
I assume, just assuming that there's strong regional cuisines
Mhm.
how did that coalesce
Mhm.
schools. Were they in Madrid or Barcelona?
So there were schools in Madrid. The one that is most associated with Madrid was run by another celebrity chef, Ignacio Domenech. Rondisoni. So I think what scholars, biographers have found fascinating about his cooking is that he was modern because he was born in Italy, grew up in Switzerland, and trained with French chef Escoffier, right? And so he brought these kinds of markers of modernity into cooking in Barcelona, but also didn't leave behind these really important regional Catalan dishes. And so that was kind of a hallmark of his way of cooking. Ignacio Domenech, somebody else is going to have to write that study, but he was a very prolific culinary gastronomical writer in this period. I think one of the most fascinating books that he wrote is called Cocina de Recursos. It came out during the Spanish Civil War and was a book that attempted to guide people for how to eat when they didn't have basic ingredients. I think one of the most emblematic recipes from that book is a tortilla de patatas. It's like a Spanish omelet, sin huevo y sin patatas. Without eggs, without potatoes. What is that? It used orange peel, right? Because that's what people had access to and what they could eat. Hope that got to your question, John. Thank you. Yes, Sandy.
Rebecca, I remember that you wrote this on and I wondered, maybe I missed it, maybe I want to clarify for me. When she wrote that cookbook, she had that was later, wasn't it?
So I think Carmen de Burgos' first cookbook, the Biblioteca Nacional has no accurate dates on these books at all. But yes, they would have come out when Carmen de Burgos was already writing on these things. My sense, Sandy, is that there was not a whole lot of overlap.
So then we could conclude that the cookbook was really without any other, it didn't have any social. I wouldn't say that's
Yeah.
the down to God.
Mhm.
She wasn't caught up in trying to better the lives of. She was fighting for her friend.
That's like, I think she was writing for middle-class women. The two cookbooks, La Cocina Española Antigua y La Cocina Española Moderna, are the two final books of a series that she created called the Biblioteca de la Mujer. Yeah, and so the idea of this entire series was to teach Spanish women about feminism. And then she ended it with cookbooks, right? And so in letters that she wrote to peers, she talks about how disillusioned she was that Spanish women didn't want to know what feminism was about. And so what I argue is that basically she tells Spanish women, these middle-class women, that to be modern and to practice good Spanish cooking, like what she thinks is vital to the Spanish race and to the Spanish nation, means that they need to have pretty tablescapes and not serve dishes that are too coarse or too vulgar. So the class associations are super sticky there. And yeah, I'll be curious to know what you think about this updated version. Thank you, Sandy. Yes, Pamela.
Thanks, it was so interesting. Thanks for the great questions. So just kind of on a, as thinking about how you work as a researcher, how did the structure of your book come together? I just learned that you did your dissertation.
Yes.
Basically the first chapter, right? So how did you decide what you were going to kind of bring together?
Right.
And sort of pull it all into a single narrative. So that's sort of the first question. The second one is really, how did you approach kind of the definition framework of feminism, right? In all of the different meanings, you did make a judgment there, right? By saying ambivalent feminist. So
right.
We're making some sort of judgment. So how did you decide to make those judgments?
Right. For this book, I knew I absolutely had to write about Emilia Pardo Bazán and Carmen de Burgos as these kind of emblematic women writers from this period, whose scholars have celebrated, like I said. As I continued researching and thinking about what I didn't know enough about, especially because it was important to me to understand not just what we could understand about the Spanish nation and Spanish women, but also about members of the working class. How could I attempt to capture understanding or ideas about what those culinary cultures of the working class may have been like? Nicolasa Pradera, details about her biography are super, super scarce. And so my approach is very much intersectional in that sense. I want to look at her as this woman who was a servant, received education, ended up being the owner of well-known established restaurants throughout Spain. What happened there that Marañón doesn't want to see or wants to reinscribe into traditional class and gender roles? And then the Institute was a wonderful suggestion by a librarian. You know, I said, this is what I'm curious about. Do you have any suggestions? Where should I look? And they said, you should absolutely go here. Conventional knowledge about the Institute is that what women did there was absolutely, ideology of domesticity, right? The Sección Femenina took it over after the Civil War. The kind of domestic education that women received through the Sección Femenina, it's just kind of assumed that that's what was happening at the Institute as well. I looked back through those archives, that entire structure, yes, it was founded by a conservative Catholic feminist, but it was founded to give culture to obreras, to working class women. That language and that mission permeates all of the writings in those actas, in those materials. And so that to me felt like that end cap for this kind of book that would show the diversity and the contradictions that come up when we try to understand women's food work from a feminist perspective during these 3 decades of the early 20th century. And as for the approach, I'm very much influenced by a group of sociologists and food study scholars who were associated with the University of Toronto. They published an important volume called Feminist Food Studies that came out a few years ago. And I think it was Psyche Williams-Forson who wrote the foreword to that book. And the thing about feminist food studies is we're not going to have a clear understanding of the kitchen as a radical progressive space. When we look closely at what people are doing, those practices and that food work, we're gonna see contradictions. We're gonna see things that make sense in certain lights and make sense and don't make sense in others. And so that approach is something that I've really taken to heart. And also the work of Meredith Abarca, who works on Latinx food cultures. One of the first and most influential books that she writes is about the abuelas, the madres who do cooking in families, Latina families in the United States. And she says that Western feminism does not understand these knowledges as knowledges of authority or as knowledges that count as intellectual. And so we really need to rethink that. And that perspective has definitely informed my understanding of food work as I defined it in the book. Thank you.
I'd like to read it. And I have a question about the concept of work.
Yes.
Because, my students at San Diego State have a conversation class and we talk about work. Most of the people assumes that, like work is what you do for a salary or like productive, right? You produce service and then there is the reproductive work, right? That is like everyday work that most of us have, that includes care, self-care. And how do you see work in that sense or how do you think or theorize that concept of work in the food, right? Because food, cooking, and sometimes in the real world producing food, right?
Mhm.
Reproducing life,
Mhm.
taking care.
Mhm.
And then you have those that are women that work, that's care workers, right?
Mhm.
They receive a salary
Mhm.
for cooking or other care work.
Mhm.
And so what's work? Isn't the title, women's
Yeah.
work? How do you see work?
How do I see work? I see that care work that happens in the home is something that absolutely, like, even if we don't pay salaries for it, I think it's striking that if you look at who does that work, it's women. It's not men for the most part. And that it is absolutely something that has not been accounted for. And for example, and here I'm going into scary territory, Danny. From my understanding from other scholars, it has not been accounted for in more traditional understandings of labor. For example, if you look at Marx, there is an excellent book that came out a few years ago called Feminism and the Servant Question, that goes into a critique of what is this about women's work, especially about servants, the care workers, right, that labor in the homes of others. Why have feminist movements in Europe not engaged those women, the people doing those projects? And I think that's absolutely something that needs to be worked on more, or that I would appreciate having resources to read more about.
There is another question, like the people who have to do care work at home without salary, they should receive funds from the government.
I mean, this is
salary, for example, taking care of elderly or the people, person with disability.
Right.
Is that part of the economy or not?
Right. I mean, more.
Right.
This is.
Yeah, if you have to take care of.
Yeah.
You can, literally, you cannot have the productive work. You are doing a reproductive work.
Absolutely.
Absolutely essential.
Yeah. And more progressive welfare states definitely pay people for doing those work. Families that receive money every month for having children, families that have, this is my naivete whenever I was a young person. A family that I knew in Germany whenever I was 21 years old had 3 children. And of course she didn't work. She received a payment from the government to do that work of caring for her children in the home.
Well, I'm thinking about what you were saying before about the way that this relationship between labor, domestic labor, and affect and care is codified into the law. And I'm thinking about the fact that even as, for example, white Spanish women have more options today than they did in the past, it's so interesting to think about how these domestic forms of labor still tend to be very feminized, right?
Absolutely.
Even if they're attached maybe to migrant women, right? But when we think about Bolivian women in Spain, right? Or Peruvian women in Spain, or Filipino women in Spain, right? That's who's doing the cooking and the cleaning, right? And it's really striking to me to think about the fact that even in Spain today, people don't really want to hire a man to take care of grandma, right? Like there's still this idea that that's a woman's job, right? And we need to find a woman to do it, right? So that this woman can do something else, but we need a woman to do that work, right?
And let me just add one additional layer of complexity. So oftentimes when we're talking about feminist praxis and studies in Latin America, what we're talking about is women and communities who have been pushed out of their indigenous or local communities that would often do this kind of culture and work in a collective setting and versus an individual setting. And because of neoliberalism or neocolonialism or all the isms that we could talk about, oftentimes are forced to leave their countries or a land of origin where they would have a communal practice of care or food, and they are reproducing those kind of cultures of care and community without the community for, let's say white women in Spain or in Italy, but this is a crucial question of what is labor and a Marxist feminist kind of framing, and how do we look at that in a multi-layered global migrant way.
Absolutely. And that's something I look forward to reading more about. But this conversation just makes me think back to one of the fascinating conversations I had with honor students in my food and politics in Spain class last semester. And I see you over there then. Really rich debate about isn't it naive to think about food work and care work as radical and as a space and as something with all of this progressive potential? But then on the other side, students brought in these excellent examples of the abuelas, right? Who's cooking in kitchens and also in, it then helped me, like street food kinds of kitchens. This is doing really important community and social building work. And this gives me an opportunity to plug a new project I just learned about in the last few days by a professor at the University of Southern California, Sarah Portnoy, has just made a documentary about the kitchens of abuelitas. And so it's hopefully going to be in the Latino Film Festival here in San Diego, but if you have a chance to look for that, I'm curious to see how she dives into some of these dynamics that you talked about so eloquently, Amanda. Sarah Portnoy, that's her name. Ilana, yes.
Are there any foods that sort of came to this national project? Or are they sort of repackaging of foods that they?
Right, that's a great question. And this is not my argument. This is Laura Anderson's argument. But her argument is that national Spanish cuisine is national because it reunites all of that regional diversity, right? And so you have ollas from all the different regions in Spain. If you look at the process of making an olla, there are lots of similarities, even though the cocido Madrid is very different than the caldo, or all the different variations that you can trace throughout Spain. So that is absolutely her argument. To answer that question, I'd be super curious. And my suspicion, Ilana, is that somebody like Ron Bisoni was absolutely doing those transformations, because we see him, the celebrity chef, magazine personality, also big part of his salary being paid by the gas company in Barcelona, also had contacts with a cocoa brand and Magi seasoning drops and all these different things. He's creating recipes that use all these manufactured ingredients, right? Creating recipes that come to form a culinary and gastronomical identity for Barcelona. And so I think in that kind of inclusion of these very kind of contemporary ingredients, contemporary in the sense that industrialized ingredients, we do see what you're talking about. Thanks for the question. Otras preguntas? Yes.
So you were talking about ingredient availability.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but think that geographically, there are certain things that you cannot reproduce. So for me, authenticity, whenever it's mentioned, I think it has to do a lot with the ingredients that are available. So certain things are not really emulated, right? Not the same. So anybody that's
right.
You cannot, the food that you eat is not going to be the same if it's replicated somewhere else. I was in Peru over the summer. Peru has over 485 potatoes.
Right.
The best gnocchi I've ever had was from Peru. And I know that gnocchi will never be able to replicate the same because how many?
Right.
So 480 percent. So my question to you is, what is, because authenticity is subjective, to you what's paramount for authenticity?
I think people have attachments to authenticity. Like just the comments that folks made, you want it to taste, you want it to smell, you want it to look like what you have that sense memory of, right? That's how we understand ourselves. That's how we understand our families. We understand our communities. And so I think looking at the concept of authenticity with that in mind, and kind of being suspicious of it and curious about it, as an intellectual project, I think is fascinating. I don't want to take away the delight and the comfort and the community ties that come from exactly what you described and exactly what another audience member talked about how those foods feel, right? But what I'll also add is that the fascinating thing about foodways is that they shift and change. all we have to think about is our industrialized food system that we have today, where we go to the grocery store and can we buy aguacates that are grown in San Diego? Probably not. Where are we buying them from? They're coming from Mexico. Where are the others coming from? In Peru. So this whole concept, which has been richly debated in studies on French cuisine and gastronomy, terroir, I don't even say it right, but it's this idea of the land gives foods and drinks a very special characteristics. I think the way our food systems work today has already disrupted that in ways that we're not so aware of on a day-to-day basis. So that's my approach to authenticity. Hopefully it's satisfying or at least understandable. Thank you. Going back to your first one, Pardo Bazán absolutely knew that she was doing political work. And we see this in how she defines traditional Spanish cuisine. She is aligning women's food work, especially that created by who she calls vejezuelas, these elderly rural women, as equivalent to all of these other national symbols that are written into national histories, that are written into, national culture. Who is she talking to about this? She is talking to her intellectual peers. There's a lovely anecdote that a researcher in Texas passed me, and this was from the Unamuno's archives. Apparently Pardo Bazán, so Unamuno, super well-known, like writer of this period, intellect, philosopher, et cetera, et cetera. Pardo Bazán was good friends with Unamuno. She sent her cookbook to Unamuno's wife, thinking perhaps that she might be interested in some of the ideas there. And so when you unpack this, what was her expectation? We don't know, but I wonder what kinds of worlds this woman straddled, right? As the wife of this famous philosopher, and Sandy, you could probably tell us lots about Unamuno. Okay. Does she share the interests of Pardo Bazán? Like, is she going to read these cookbooks and understand the kind of nation building practice in them? Or is she another one of these middle-class readers that Pardo Bazán was so frustrated with? I think it's a lovely question to consider. And I was delighted to be able to include that anecdote. Francesca Bonmaison, she was the founder of the Institute in the last chapter, absolutely a political actor. She was a close friend of the head of the Lliga Regionalista, which was the Catalan nationalist political party of Catalonia during that moment. And so what she did in the Institute was absolutely an expression of her Catalan nationalism. So I hope that.
A quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Were there ever women chef instructors at the Institute?
There were, but shockingly and most interestingly, most of the leadership of this institute were women in all of its capacities as patrons, as donors, as professors, as directors, with the exception of the culinary staff. Women gave classes in domestic economy, but Rondi Soni and two other men were the ones who were in charge of these cooking classes. Excellent question. Thank you so much.
Well, maybe just one last question.
Oh.
One last question. Okay, so I will confess, I read the chapter 3 about Gregorio Marañón and Nicolasa Pradera. But now that we're having this big picture talk and I'm thinking about that chapter again, I'm a little bit.
What would you recommend to revise?
No. But my question is, why did Gregorio Marañón care about Nicolasa Pradera? I mean, we're talking about two vastly different figures in the historical sort of panorama, right? Mm-hmm. This, towering doctor, political, intellectual figure, and on the other hand, a working class woman who, cooked her way up the social ladder. Mm-hmm. Why did he write about her? Why did he care? What did he see in her? What was he trying to do with her? How was that related to his bigger project?
He cared because he had a Basque peasant nursemaid. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's an effective connection between what Nicolasa Pradera represents, like she is the connection to the peasant nursemaid who cooked for him and cared for him during his childhood. He also was a eugenicist, which we can't forget. And so there is a connection there, which I don't explore in the book, just to be clear. I touched on these topics a little bit in the last chapter, but concerns about the health and the bodies of working class Spaniards, fear about their degeneracy. What should these people eat? How should their households be run in order to ensure that they were capable of being healthy modern citizens? Ultimately, Martin wrote a good bit about food. This is not the only work that he did. I think Laura Anderson's most recent book, or another article, has talked about his work on oranges in particular. But he was also very dismayed about the upheaval and the threat of disintegration of the Spanish Second Republic. And so reframing somebody like Nicolasa Pradida, her food as something authentic, that word again, and Spanish, but also representative of its modernity, and a version of modernity that was easy to digest and that was pretty and that didn't introduce contradictions, was very important to him. And it's something that you see also in tourist initiatives of the same period. This idea of wanting to present Spain to outsiders as not something that was just too much onion and too much garlic and burnt olive oil, but something that could be palatable and consumed in all of its ways by outsiders.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. This is the first day I've actually seen this book and held it. So it is over here if anybody would like to purchase it. I would be delighted, and also to have a conversation with you afterwards. And I appreciate so much that you all came out. Thanks so much. Bye.